A pilot's career built over 3 decades and millions of miles ended the moment he uttered 5 contemptuous words, "You're a fake passenger." He said this to a quiet, unassuming black woman in a simple navy blue pantsuit. He saw her as an annoyance, a disruption to his perfectly ordered kingdom of the sky. What he failed to see were the steel in her eyes and the federal credentials in her hand, credentials that identified her not as a passenger, but as his worst nightmare. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about what happens when arrogance at 35,000 feet collides with absolute authority on the ground. Stay tuned for a shocking tale of karma, where one man's bias didn't just cost him his job, it unraveled an entire career of deceit. The air in Terminal C of Chicago O'Hare International Airport hummed with the usual organized chaos. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October, and the slant of the autumn sun cast long shadows across the polished floors. Business travelers tapped furiously on laptops, families tried to corral restless children, and the scent of overpriced coffee and Cinnabon hung heavy in the air. At gate C-27, the destination was Dallas-Fort Worth, a routine 3-hour flight on Ascendair, a budget luxury carrier known for its aggressive expansion and its even more aggressive on-time departure record. Among the crowd waiting to board Flight 815 was Dr. Emma Reed. To anyone who glanced her way, she was utterly unremarkable, and she cultivated that image with meticulous care. In her late 40s, she wore a simple but well-tailored navy pantsuit, sensible low heels, and glasses with a thin, unassuming frame. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, professional bun. There was no flashy jewelry, no designer handbag. The only item that hinted at her purpose was a sturdy black leather briefcase that sat squarely on her lap. She read through a sheaf of papers, her expression neutral, her focus absolute. Emma Reed was a master of observation, a phantom in the machine of modern aviation. Her quiet demeanor was a carefully constructed facade, masking a mind as sharp as a turbine blade, and an authority that could ground an entire fleet of aircraft with a single phone call. She was the FAA's Chief Inspector for the Central Region, a position she had earned through 2 decades of relentless work, first as an NTSB crash investigator, then as a field agent, and now as the person responsible for ensuring the operational safety and integrity of every airline flying in and out of the nation's heartland. Her work often required anonymity. Today was a line check, an unannounced observation of a flight crew during a routine operation. It was one of the most effective tools the FAA had for getting a genuine snapshot of how an airline functioned when it didn't know it was being watched. She wasn't looking for trouble, but she was trained to find it in a skipped pre-flight check, a lax cockpit protocol, or a hint of complacency in a pilot's voice. When the gate agent announced pre-boarding for Ascendair's Platinum Elite members, Emma didn't move. She waited until Zone 3 was called, blending in with the economy passengers. She handed her boarding pass to the smiling agent, who scanned it with a cheerful, "Have a great flight, ma'am." "Thank you," Emma replied, her voice soft but clear. She walked down the jet bridge, the muffled sounds of the airport giving way to the gentle hum of the Boeing 737-800's auxiliary power unit. At the aircraft door, she was greeted by the lead flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s, with a practiced professional smile named Sarah Jenkins. "Welcome aboard," Sarah said warmly. "Good morning," Emma responded, holding out her credentials instead of her boarding pass. The laminated ID card with its official seal and her serious-looking photo was unmistakable. "Dr. Emma Reed, Federal Aviation Administration. I'm here to conduct a line check. I'll need access to the cockpit jump seat for the duration of the flight." Sarah Jenkins's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something surprise anxiety passed through her eyes. An unannounced FAA check was never a welcome event. It meant reports, scrutiny, and a palpable tension that would permeate the entire flight. She had been with Ascendair for 12 years and had only seen this happen twice before. "Of course, Dr. Reed." "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone shifting from customer service warmth to professional deference. "Let me just inform the captain. Please have a seat right here in the galley for a moment." Emma nodded and took the small attendant seat, placing her briefcase at her feet. She could hear the murmur of passengers filing past, finding their seats, the clicks of overhead bins closing. From her vantage point, she observed Sarah's posture, her calm demeanor, and the way she continued to greet passengers even as she processed this new development. The crew's initial reaction to her presence was the first data point in her evaluation. So far, Sarah was handling it by the book. Sarah stepped into the cockpit. The door was ajar, and Emma could hear the clipped technical conversation of the pilots as they ran through their pre-flight checklists. Captain Thorne Sarah's voice was low but firm. "Excuse me. We have an FAA inspector on board, Dr. Emma Reed. She's requested the jump seat for a line check to Dallas." There was a pause. Then a man's voice, deep and laced with irritation, cut through the low hum of the cockpit. "You're kidding me. Today." Of all days, the voice belonged to Captain Marcus Thorne. "Did you see her credentials?" "Yes, Captain. They look perfectly in order." All right. Tell her to wait." "We're in the middle of a sequence," Thorne grumbled. It wasn't a welcoming response, but it wasn't overtly hostile either. It was, however, the second data point. Complacency tinged with annoyance. Emma waited patiently. She had heard it all before. To many pilots, especially veteran captains, an FAA inspector was a gnat buzzing around their perfectly controlled universe. They saw it as a judgment on their skills, an intrusion into their sacred domain. A few minutes later, the cockpit door swung fully open, and Captain Marcus Thorne filled the doorway. He was a man in his late 50s who looked every bit the stereotypical airline captain, tall, silver-haired, with a chiseled jaw and an air of unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance. His uniform was immaculate, the 4 stripes on his epaulets gleaming under the cabin lights. He was the king of this metal tube, and his expression made it clear that he didn't appreciate unexpected visitors in his court. He looked down at Emma, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe. It was a dismissive, appraising glance, the kind one might give to a piece of misplaced luggage. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her a subtle but significant act of depersonalization. "I'm Captain Thorne," he said, not offering a hand. "Sarah tells me you think you're with the FAA." The word think hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Emma met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "Dr. Emma Reed," she stated calmly, holding up her credentials again. "And I don't think I am." Thorne barely glanced at the ID. His eyes narrowed, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked past her at the line of passengers still boarding, then back at her simple pantsuit and the lack of any official FAA windbreaker or insignia on her clothes. His mind, steeped in 3 decades of ingrained patterns and biases, saw a black woman in a plain outfit, and it simply did not compute with the image of authority he held in his head. He let out a short, derisive laugh. "Right. Look, lady, I don't know what you're trying to pull," he said, his voice loud enough for the first officer and a few nearby passengers to hear. "We've had people try to get a free upgrade, even try to get into the cockpit for a joyride before. This is a new one, I'll give you that." He folded his arms across his chest, a posture of absolute, unassailable authority. "This is a secure flight deck. We're not playing games here." He then turned to Sarah Jenkins, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sarah, call airport security. We have a fake passenger trying to access the cockpit." The words "fake passenger" echoed in the confined space of the galley. They were not just an accusation. They were a dismissal of Emma Reed's identity, her career and her authority, all delivered with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been seriously challenged. The passengers in the first few rows who had been settling into their seats turned their heads, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Sarah Jenkins, the lead flight attendant, froze. Her training had prepared her for medical emergencies, unruly passengers, and security threats. It had not prepared her for her own captain publicly humiliating a woman who held credentials that looked to her experienced eye completely legitimate. Every instinct told her that Captain Thorne was making a catastrophic mistake. Calling security on a federal agent was an act of professional suicide. Captain Sarah said, her voice a strained whisper trying to de-escalate. "Perhaps you should take another look at her identification. It has the federal watermark." Thorne waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at Emma again. "I don't need to look at it. It's a joke. Get security." Inside the cockpit, the first officer, a young, meticulous pilot named Dennis Miller, overheard the entire exchange with growing horror. He'd only been flying with Thorne for 3 months, but he was well aware of the captain's reputation. Thorne was an old-school pilot, a master of the aircraft, but known for his towering ego and his disdain for what he called bureaucratic nonsense. Miller knew that FAA line checks were a real and serious part of their world. He also knew that the woman's calm, unwavering demeanor was the opposite of someone trying to pull a fast one. Emma Reed remained seated, her posture unchanged. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply held Captain Thorne's gaze. The firestorm of emotions, she felt a familiar, weary anger at the casual prejudice mixed with the cold, precise fury of a professional whose authority was being unlawfully obstructed, was carefully locked away. Showing emotion now would be a tactical error. "Captain Thorne," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with chilling clarity, "I am going to advise you one time and one time only. You are currently in violation of Federal Aviation Regulation 121.5 or 48, which guarantees an authorized FAA inspector access to the flight deck. By obstructing me, you are interfering with the duties of a federal officer. Your refusal to verify my credentials and your decision to escalate this situation without cause will be noted in my official report." She spoke with the passionless precision of a lawyer reading a verdict. Each word was carefully chosen, a brick being laid in the wall of his own professional ruin. The mention of the specific regulation number was a masterstroke. It wasn't the kind of detail a fake passenger would know. First Officer Miller's blood ran cold. He knew that regulation. Every pilot did. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Captain, maybe I should—" "Stay put, Miller." Thorne snapped, not taking his eyes off Emma. The challenge to his authority, especially from a woman he had already dismissed, had enraged him. His ego was now fully in control, overriding decades of training and procedure. He saw this not as a procedural issue but a personal one. He was being questioned on his aircraft in front of his crew. "A regulation number." Thorne chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "You looked that up on Google before you came on board, cute. I'm not playing this game." He looked pointedly at Sarah. "Are you deaf? Get me security. Now." Sarah was trapped between the immovable object of a federal agent and the unstoppable force of her captain's ego. Protocol dictated she obey the captain, but her gut screamed that obeying him would make her complicit in a career-ending disaster. Emma slowly stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she projected an aura of immense authority that seemed to make her grow in stature. "There will be no need to call airport security, flight attendant," Emma said, her voice still level, but now with an undeniable edge of command. She turned her attention back to Thorne. "Because I will be making a call of my own. You have chosen this course of action, Captain. You have delayed this flight, you have challenged federal authority, and you have done so based on nothing more than your own personal prejudice." She reached into her jacket and pulled out her phone. "You had a chance to handle this with professionalism. That chance is now gone." The passengers nearby were now openly staring, their phones discreetly pointed toward the front of the plane. The quiet hum of the cabin was gone, replaced by a thick, anxious silence. Dennis Miller in the cockpit could see the departure time on their schedule tick from green to yellow, indicating a delay. This was spiraling out of control. Thorne, however, saw Emma's phone call as another bluff. "Go ahead. Call whoever you want. Call the president. It won't change the fact that you aren't getting into my cockpit." He turned on his heel and strode back into the flight deck, pulling the heavy door shut with a definitive click. It was a gesture of ultimate finality. The king was back in his castle, the drawbridge raised. He settled into his seat, strapping himself in. "Let's get back to the checklist, Dennis," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Let security handle the crazy lady." Dennis Miller looked at his captain, then at the closed cockpit door. He felt a profound sense of dread. Thorne thought he had won, that he had vanquished a nuisance. But Dennis knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Captain Marcus Thorne hadn't just closed a door. He had sealed his own tomb. Outside in the galley, Emma Reed was already dialing a number. She wasn't calling airport security. She was calling a number that would bypass the local FAA field office, a direct line to the heart of the FAA's command structure. "This is Inspector Reed, ID number 741 Alpha," she said into the phone, her voice low and devoid of any emotion. "I am on a send-air flight 8:15 at O'Hare Gate, C-27. I am invoking a red flag authority stop. I have been denied access to the flight deck by the pilot in command, Captain Marcus Thorne. He has refused to verify my credentials and has accused me of being a fraudulent passenger. The aircraft is not to be moved from the gate under any circumstances. I repeat, ground this aircraft immediately. A full security and compliance team is required at my location. Acknowledge." On the other end of the line, in a sterile operations center, miles away, a series of alarms, both literal and figurative, began to sound. A red flag authority stop was an emergency protocol of the highest order, an action that set in motion a cascade of events that would ripple up to the highest levels of both the FAA and Ascendair. Emma ended the call and looked at the stunned flight attendant. "This flight," she said with quiet finality, "is not going anywhere for a while." The click of the cockpit door shutting was for Captain Marcus Thorne, a punctuation mark on his victory. He settled into his left-hand seat, the worn leather familiar and comforting. This was his domain, a space of order, procedure, and absolute authority. He had repelled a boarder of fraud who had dared to challenge him. He felt a surge of righteous indignation. The sheer audacity of it. "Can you believe the nerve of some people?" he muttered to his first officer, flipping a few switches on the overhead panel with practiced ease, probably trying to get a story for some blog. I scammed my way into a 737 cockpit. Pathetic. First Officer Dennis Miller didn't reply. He was staring at the instruments, but his mind was replaying the scene in the galley. Dr. Reed's calm recitation of the FAA regulation, her unwavering confidence, the chilling finality in her voice as she'd pulled out her phone. None of it felt like a scam. It felt like a warning. Captain Dennis began choosing his words carefully. With all due respect, her credentials looked authentic. The new FAA IDs have a specific holographic overlay. I saw it from here. Maybe we should just Maybe you should just focus on your checklist." Dennis Thorne cut him off, his voice sharp. The slightest hint of dissent was to him a form of betrayal. "I'm the pilot in command. I make the call on who gets into my flight deck, and my call is that she's a fake. End of story. Now are the flaps set for takeoff, or are we going to sit here all day?" But they were going to sit there. Minutes began to stretch. The final passengers had boarded, the cabin doors were closed, but the jet bridge remained stubbornly attached to the aircraft. The gate agent hadn't given them the all-clear for pushback. A message flickered onto their ASAR's screen, the digital communication system linking the aircraft to the airline's operations center. 815, standby gate, ATC delay. Thorne grunted. "Great. Now we're delayed. See what she did. Caused a whole mess. They'll get her off the plane, and we'll still be stuck here explaining it for an hour." He was already constructing the narrative in his head. He had acted decisively to neutralize a potential security threat. He would be lauded for his vigilance. In the cabin, the atmosphere had soured. Passengers were growing restless. The initial entertainment of the confrontation had worn off, replaced by the familiar frustration of a delay. Sarah Jenkins and her team of flight attendants moved through the aisles with forced smiles, offering water and vague apologies about a slight operational issue. Sarah avoided looking toward the galley where Emma Reed now stood, phone to her ear, speaking in low, measured tones. Emma was on the phone with Robert Henderson, the Vice President of Flight Operations for Ascendair. Her call to the FAA Command Center had triggered an immediate frantic call from the FAA to Ascendair's corporate headquarters. The name Dr. Emma Reed had landed on Henderson's desk like a grenade with the pin pulled. Robert Henderson was a corporate man to his core. He lived and breathed metrics on time, percentages, fuel costs, customer satisfaction scores. A red flag stop by the Chief Inspector of the Central Region was a 5-alarm fire. It was a PR nightmare, a regulatory catastrophe, and a financial disaster all rolled into one. "Dr. Reed, this is Bob Henderson at Ascendair. I am so terribly sorry for this misunderstanding." He stammered into the phone, his voice slick with panic. He was in his corner office in Dallas, a world away from Gate C-27, but he could feel the heat. Mr. Henderson, Emma's voice was like ice. "This has moved far beyond a misunderstanding. Your pilot in command, Captain Marcus Thorne, has refused me access to his flight deck, which is a direct violation of federal law. He has refused to verify my credentials. He has accused me of being a fraudulent passenger in front of his crew and other passengers, and he has instructed his staff to call security on a federal officer. The only misunderstanding seems to be his comprehension of his duties as a pilot licensed by the Federal Aviation Administration." Henderson winced. He could practically hear the fines racking up with every syllable she spoke. "Doctor, I assure you, Captain Thorne is one of our most senior pilots. There must be some explanation. Is there anything I can do to resolve this right now? Can I speak to him and clear this up so you can get on your way? That will no longer be necessary," Emma replied coolly. "You cannot clear this up. The situation is now in the hands of the FAA. Your aircraft has been grounded by my authority. A team from our Chicago field office is en route to the gate. They will handle the situation from here. My instruction to you is this. You will inform your captain that Flight 815 is grounded indefinitely. He is not to communicate with air traffic control. He is not to move this aircraft. He is to remain in the cockpit and await my instructions. Is that clear?" "Yes, Dr. Reed." "Crystal clear." Henderson said, his mind racing. He needed to get ahead of this. He had to contain the damage. As Emma disconnected the call, she saw two uniformed Chicago aviation police officers walking down the jet bridge. They had likely been dispatched at Sarah's initial hesitant request. They stopped at the aircraft door looking uncertainly at Sarah, then at Emma. Before they could speak, Emma addressed them. "Officers, thank you for your prompt response. I am Dr. Emma Reed of the FAA. This is an active federal situation. We do not require your assistance at this time, but I would ask that you remain on the jet bridge to ensure no one deplanes until my team arrives." The officers, recognizing a higher authority when they saw one, simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Back in the cockpit, a new ACARS message blinked onto the screen. This one was not from the local dispatcher. It was flagged as urgent from VP Flight Ops. Thorne's brow furrowed. He'd never gotten a direct message from Henderson on the flight deck before. He opened it. The text was in all caps, a clear sign of corporate panic. Capt. Thorne, "Do not move aircraft. Do not contact ATC. Ground stop in effect by order of FAA. Await instructions. Confirm receipt." Thorne stared at the screen. The blood drained from his face. Ground stop by order of the FAA. He looked at Dennis Miller, whose own expression was grim. "What the hell is this?" Thorne whispered. But he already knew. The woman in the pantsuit. The phone call. It wasn't a bluff. The cockpit intercom buzzed. It was Sarah. Thorne jabbed the button. What Captain Sarah's voice was shaking slightly, but she kept it professional. "You have a call from Mr. Henderson on the satellite phone." Thorne picked up the receiver, his hand suddenly slick with sweat. "Thorne here. Marcus, what in God's name did you do?" Robert Henderson's voice was a furious hiss. There was no pretense, no corporate politeness, just raw, unadulterated panic. "Bob, there's a woman out here claiming to be FAA. She isn't claiming anything, you idiot," Henderson roared, losing his composure entirely. "That's Dr. Emma Reed. She's the Chief Regional Inspector. She can revoke your license, my license, and the operating certificate for this entire airline with a pen stroke. Did you seriously call her a fake passenger?" The title Chief Regional Inspector hit Marcus Thorne like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. It was impossible. The woman in the cheap pantsuit, the one he had laughed at, his mind reeled trying to reconcile the image of the unassuming woman in the galley with the colossal, career-ending power Henderson was describing. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed an act of sacrilege against the very institution that governed his existence. "Bob, I didn't know," he stammered, his legendary confidence crumbling into dust. "Of course you didn't know. You didn't bother to look. You didn't bother to listen," Henderson yelled. "Just stay put, Marcus. Don't speak to anyone. Don't do anything. You have no idea the magnitude of the mess you've just created." The line went dead. Thorne slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. The cockpit, once his kingdom, now felt like a cage. The hum of the electronics sounded like a death knell. He looked at the closed cockpit door, the barrier he had so arrogantly erected. On the other side of that door was not a fake passenger, but the executioner of his career. And he had personally invited her in. The arrival of the FAA field team was swift and surgical. 3 individuals in dark blue FAA jackets, led by a stern-looking man named John Peterson, walked down the jet bridge with an air of grim purpose. The Chicago aviation police officers parted to let them through. Peterson, the head of the O'Hare field office, met Emma at the doorway. He was a man she had known for years. "Emma," he said, his voice low and serious, "what a mess." The report came through as a Level 1 obstruction. Is that accurate completely? "John," she replied, her composure absolute, the pilot in command. Captain Thorne refused a lawful inspection, refused to verify my credentials, and made a series of unprofessional and discriminatory remarks. He then barricaded himself in the cockpit. Peterson's jaw tightened. Unacceptable. He turned to one of his agents. "Get the gate agent. We're deplaning the passengers. Rebook them on the next available flight, offer them meal vouchers, the works. Ascendair is paying for all of it." He then looked at Emma. "What do you want to do about the flight crew?" This was a critical moment. Emma had the authority to have Thorne removed in handcuffs. She could make a public spectacle of it, a brutal and visible display of power. But that wasn't her style. Her goal was not vengeance. It was compliance and safety. The damage to Thorne's career was already done. Now she needed to conduct her inspection. "We will proceed with the flight," Emma stated her decision, surprising Peterson. "But not with these passengers. This will now be a non-revenue ferry flight to Dallas. Just the crew and us. I came here to conduct a line check on this flight crew, and that is exactly what I am going to do. I want to observe Captain Thorne's behavior in the cockpit now that he is fully aware of the situation. I want to see his procedures under pressure. I want to see how his first officer reacts. The data from this flight will be invaluable." It was a brilliant, cold-blooded move. Thorne's punishment would not be a swift removal, but a slow, agonizing flight under the direct, unwavering scrutiny of the woman he had just tried to destroy. He would have to perform his duties perfectly, while she sat mere feet behind him, her pen taking notes that would decide his fate. It was a far more potent form of justice. Peterson nodded, understanding immediately. "All right, the crew remains. You, me, and Agent Miller will be the only passengers." He turned to Sarah Jenkins, who had been watching the exchange with wide, fearful eyes. "Ma'am, please make an announcement. Due to an unforeseen operational requirement, this flight to Dallas has been cancelled. All passengers will deplane and see an Ascendair agent at the gate for rebooking information and compensation. Please begin an orderly deplaning process immediately." Sarah, grateful for a concrete instruction, sprang into action. The announcement was met with a collective groan from the cabin. Deplaning was a slow, grumbling affair, but within 30 minutes, the aircraft was empty, save for the flight crew and the FAA officials. The silence that descended was heavy and unnatural. It was time to face the captain. Emma, with Peterson at her side, walked to the cockpit door. She knocked twice, a sharp, authoritative rap. There was a moment of hesitation before the lock clicked and the door swung inward. Marcus Thorne was sitting in his seat, but he was a changed man. The arrogant, swaggering captain was gone. In his place was a pale, hollowed-out figure. His face was ashen, his hands were clenched on his lap, and his eyes, when they met Emma's, were filled with a dawning, sickening terror. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, the ghost of his own career. First Officer Dennis Miller stood beside him, his expression a mixture of fear and grim validation. He had known this was coming. Emma stepped into the cockpit, the small space suddenly charged with an unbearable tension. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at Thorne, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to confront the full weight of his actions. It was Thorne who broke first. He fumbled to unbuckle his seatbelt, half standing in the cramped space. "Dr. Reed, Ma'am," he stammered, his voice cracking. I am so profoundly sorry. There is no excuse. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. A misunderstanding." Emma held up a hand, cutting him off. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the force of a tribunal. "Save it, Captain," she said. "Your apologies are irrelevant to me. My only concern is the safety and integrity of the national airspace system, which you have compromised today with your reckless behavior. You did not make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to believe your own prejudice over the federal credentials presented to you. You chose to obstruct a lawful inspection. You chose ego over procedure. She turned to Dennis Miller. First Officer Miller, what were your thoughts during this incident? Dennis swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Thorne. This was his moment of truth. He could try to placate his captain, or he could tell the truth to the FAA. He chose the latter. Ma'am, he began, his voice steady. I believed your credentials were valid from the start. I advised the captain to reconsider his assessment, but I was instructed to remain at my station. I believe the captain's actions were contrary to standard operating procedure and did not reflect the professional standards of Ascendair. Thorne flinched, as if he'd been struck. His own first officer, his co-pilot, had just testified against him. The betrayal was absolute. Emma nodded, making a mental note of Miller's professionalism. Thank you, Mr. Miller. She then turned her gaze back to the captain. Captain Thorne, this aircraft is now operating as FAA Flight 815 Alpha. It is a non-revenue ferry to Dallas. Your crew will consist of yourself, First Officer Miller, and the required cabin staff. Your passengers will be myself, Field Office Chief Peterson, and Agent Miller. You will conduct this flight precisely by the book. Every checklist, every call-out, every procedure will be executed to the letter. I will be in the jump seat, observing and recording your every action. Do you understand your instructions? Yes. Yes, ma'am, Thorne whispered, sinking back into his chair. He looked defeated, broken. Good, Emma said, her tone clinical. Now, before we begin, I will need to see your pilot's license and your medical certificate. And I will be taking a copy of the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder upon our arrival in Dallas. Thorne's hands trembled as he reached into his flight bag to produce his documents. Handing them over felt like a surrender. The CVR and FDR, the black boxes, would contain a perfect, unbiased record of everything he had said and done, every corner he had ever cut. The investigation was no longer just about this one incident. It was about his entire career. As Emma took his license, their eyes met one last time. In his, she saw the desperate plea of a man trying to find a foothold in a landslide. In her own, there was nothing. No anger, no triumph, no pity. There was only the cold, clear light of unimpeachable authority. The unveiling was complete. The king had been dethroned in his own castle not by a show of force, but by the quiet, inexorable weight of the truth. The pushback from Gate C-27 was the quietest Marcus Thorne had ever experienced. There was no casual banter with the ground crew, no light-hearted jokes with his first officer. There was only the hum of the engines, the clipped formal language of the checklists, and the palpable presence of Dr. Emma Reed, sitting in the jump seat directly behind him. Her presence was a physical weight. Thorne could feel her eyes on him, on his hands, as they moved across the controls on the instruments he was scanning. He was acutely aware of every breath he took, every word he spoke. He had flown this route thousands of times. The Chicago to Dallas run was as familiar to him as the back of his own hand. But today, every action felt alien and clumsy. His confidence, once his defining trait had evaporated, replaced by a raw, gnawing fear. First Officer Dennis Miller, by contrast, was a model of calm professionalism. He moved through the pre-takeoff procedures with a crisp efficiency, his voice clear and steady during the call-outs. He understood the gravity of the situation. He was no longer just a co-pilot. He was a witness. His performance on this flight was not just about flying the plane. It was about demonstrating his own competence and his commitment to procedure in the face of his captain's catastrophic failure. He was flying for his future. Thorne was flying for his past. Ascendair 815. Alpha runway 28 right. Cleared for takeoff. The tower controller's voice crackled through their headsets. Cleared for takeoff. 28 right, ascend air. 8:15. Alpha Dennis responded. Thorne gripped the yoke, his knuckles white. He advanced the throttles, and the 737 surged forward. The roar of the engines filled the cockpit. For a fleeting moment, as the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, things felt normal. He was a pilot in his element, master of a complex and powerful machine. But the illusion shattered as soon as they leveled off at their cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. The intense focus of takeoff gave way to the long, quiet monotony of the cruise phase, and the silence in the cockpit returned thicker and more oppressive than before. Behind him, Emma Reed made no sound, but he could hear the faint scratch of her pen on a notepad. Every slight deviation from protocol, every mumbled word, every shortcut he might have taken on a normal day was now impossible. He was performing surgery under a microscope. He thought back to the moment in the galley. How could he have been so blind, so stupidly, suicidally arrogant? He had built his entire identity around being Captain Marcus Thorne, a man in charge, a man who didn't get questioned. He had seen a black woman in a plain suit, and his mind, clouded by years of unexamined bias, had leapt to the most dismissive conclusion possible. He hadn't seen a federal officer. He had seen someone who didn't belong in his world, someone who was challenging his authority, and he had reacted with the territorial aggression of a threatened animal. Now, sitting in the silence, he couldn't escape the memory of the smirk on his own face as he'd called her a fake passenger. The sound of his own condescending laughter replayed in his mind. He felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't just shame, it was a profound self-loathing. He had always seen himself as a hero, a calm head in a crisis. But today, he had created the crisis, and he had failed the test of his own character in the most spectacular way imaginable. An hour into the flight, Emma spoke for the first time. Her voice was calm and clinical. "Captain Thorne, please state the full call-out for the cross-feed valve check. The one you performed 10 minutes ago." Thorne froze. He had done the check, but had he used the full formal call-out, or had he used the abbreviated version that most senior pilots used out of habit? He couldn't remember. His mind was a blank. Dennis Miller, sensing his captain's hesitation, subtly pointed to the checklist on his display. Thorne cleared his throat. "Checklist complete cross-feed valve." Checked and closed. "The proper call-out, Captain, as per the Ascend Air Operations Manual, is fuel cross-feed valve selector, verified, closed and guarded." Emma stated, her voice flat. "Please adhere to the approved manual phraseology for the remainder of the flight." "Yes, ma'am." Thorne mumbled the words, tasting like ash. It was a minuscule error, one that would never have been noticed on a normal flight. But today, it was another nail in his coffin. She was documenting his incompetence, his sloppiness, his inability to function under pressure. From his seat in the back of the otherwise empty cabin, John Peterson watched the cockpit door. He had seen careers end before, but rarely in such a drawn-out, psychologically brutal manner. Emma's method was devastatingly effective. She wasn't just firing a pilot, she was dissecting him, forcing him to participate in his own professional autopsy piece by painful piece. As they began their descent into the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the workload in the cockpit increased. Radio calls became more frequent, and the checklists for approach and landing were complex. Thorne, his nerves frayed, struggled to keep up. He fumbled a radio frequency change, and Denish'd to correct him. He was late in calling for the landing gear to be lowered, forcing a small but noticeable adjustment to their approach path. Emma's pen kept moving. Each mistake, no matter how small, compounded Thorne's humiliation. He was no longer flying the plane. He was fighting it, and fighting himself. The effortless grace he had once possessed was gone, stripped away by shame and fear. The landing was firm but safe. As the 737 taxied toward a remote stand away from the main terminal, Thorne knew this was the end of the line. The usual sense of relief and accomplishment after a successful flight was absent. In its place was a hollow emptiness. As he ran the shutdown checklist, the final act of his final flight, he caught his reflection in the dark screen of a navigation display. He saw a tired, frightened old man. The 4 stripes on his epaulets, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a costume he was no longer worthy of wearing. When the engine spooled down into silence, the quiet in the cockpit was absolute. Captain Thorne First Officer Miller Emma said, breaking the stillness, "Do not leave the cockpit. My team and I will secure the CVR and FDR. After that, you will be escorted to the Ascendair corporate offices, where you will be met by Mr. Henderson. You will surrender your company ID and be debriefed. Am I understood?" "Yes, ma'am," they both replied in unison. Emma stood up her notepad, filled with observations. She gave Thorne one last, lingering look. It was a look of profound disappointment, not just in him as a pilot, but in what he represented, the rot of arrogance and prejudice that could undermine the entire safety culture she had dedicated her life to protecting. She turned and left the cockpit without another word, closing the door behind her. The click echoed with the finality of a gavel. Marcus Thorne was alone with his first officer, a stranger to him now, in the silent, darkened cockpit that had been his kingdom for 30 years. It was over. The long, silent flight to Dallas hadn't just been a journey between 2 cities. It had been the final agonizing chapter of his life in the sky. The Ascendair corporate headquarters near DFW Airport felt like a fortress under siege. The news of what had happened on Flight 815 had spread through the executive levels like a contagion. Robert Henderson had been in damage control mode for hours, fielding frantic calls from the board of directors and the company's legal team. When Captain Thorne and First Officer Miller were escorted into a sterile, windowless conference room, Henderson was waiting for them, his face a mask of grim fury. "Give me your ID, both of you," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a request. Thorne, looking utterly defeated, slid his company credentials across the polished mahogany table. Dennis Miller did the same, his movements precise and deliberate. Henderson picked up Thorne's ID, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. 32 years, Marcus. 32 years with this airline and its predecessors. You were a legend, and you burned it all to the ground in 5 minutes because you couldn't be bothered to look at an ID card. "Bob, Thorne started, but Henderson cut him off with a slice of his hand. Don't say a word. You are suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation, which I assure you will be a formality. Go home. Don't talk to the press. Don't talk to the union yet. Just go." Thorne nodded, numbly stood up and walked out of the room, a ghost in the uniform he would never wear again. Henderson then turned to Dennis Miller. His tone softened slightly, but was still laced with ice. "Mr. Miller, you were in a difficult position." "Yes, sir," Dennis said. "Dr. Reed's preliminary report notes that you attempted to advise the captain against his course of action." Henderson continued, looking at a printout. "She also notes your performance during the flight to Dallas was exemplary under extreme duress. You are also suspended standard procedure when an incident occurs. But your suspension is with pay, and it is administrative. We will need a full, detailed statement from you. Be honest. Be thorough. Your future with this airline depends on it." "I understand," Sir Dennis said. He knew this was his chance to separate himself from Thorne's toxicity to prove his own mettle. Meanwhile, in another part of the building that had been temporarily commandeered by the FAA, Dr. Emma Reed was leading the investigation. This was no longer just a line check. It was a full-scale audit of a pilot's entire career. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder from Flight 815 were just the beginning. Emma sat at the head of a long table with John Peterson and a team of specialists. They had Thorne's complete personnel file, a stack of paper nearly a foot thick. They had his training records, his past check ride, results, his simulator evaluations, and every single incident report he had ever been associated with. "Let's start with the CVR from this morning," Emma said. They played the recording. Hearing the incident again with the cold digital clarity of the recorder was even more damning. Thorne's arrogant, dismissive tone, his condescending laugh, his outright refusal to follow procedure, it was all there. They heard Sarah Jenkins's professional attempts to de-escalate and Dennis Miller's quiet, ignored warning. And they heard Emma's own calm, precise voice laying out the regulation he was violating. It was an open and shut case of pilot misconduct. But Emma was looking for something more. "This level of arrogance doesn't just appear overnight," she mused, looking at the team. "It's cultivated. It grows in the dark. Let's pull his records for the last 5 years. I want to see every check ride, every simulator session. Cross-reference it with any anonymous crew complaints filed against him." That's when the unraveling began. A junior analyst found the first thread. "Dr. Reed, look at this. Captain Thorne has had the same FAA designated check airman, a man named George Ballard, sign off on his last 6 proficiency checks. Is that unusual?" Peterson asked. "It's not forbidden, but it's cozy," Emma said, her eyes narrowing. "Pilots are supposed to have their checks done by a rotating pool of evaluators to prevent exactly this kind of familiarity." Let's look at Ballard's record. They discovered that George Ballard was an old friend of Thorne's, a retired pilot who did contract work for Ascendair. A deeper dive into the flight data from those check rides revealed a pattern. The simulator scenarios Thorne was put through were always the same. A simple engine failure on takeoff, a routine instrument approach in bad weather. He was never given the complex multi-system failure scenarios designed to test a pilot's true decision-making skills under pressure. His check rides had been pencil-whipped, rubber-stamped approvals from a friend. Then they found the anonymous complaints. 3 in the last 2 years. One from a flight attendant who reported Thorne for creating a hostile and intimidating cockpit environment. Another from a junior first officer who claimed Thorne regularly skipped entire sections of the pre-flight checklist, calling them a waste of time. A third complaint detailed an incident where Thorne had descended below the minimum safe altitude on approach to Aspen, a notoriously difficult airport, triggering a ground proximity warning. Each complaint had been investigated internally by Ascendair and dismissed with the note, "Interviewed Captain Thorne." Attributed to crew misunderstanding. No further action. "He wasn't just a bigot," Peterson said, shaking his head. "He was a liability, a crash waiting to happen." And the airline enabled him. Emma added her voice, hard. They protected their senior captain, their legend, instead of listening to the safety concerns of their junior crew members. This rot goes deeper than one pilot. The investigation expanded. They audited Thorne's flight logs against maintenance records. They found discrepancies. On at least a dozen occasions, Thorne had signed off on the aircraft logs as clear of any issues only for the next crew to report a minor but persistent problem that he had clearly ignored, a flickering warning light, a sticky flap indicator. He was cutting corners to maintain his precious on-time record gambling with the safety of his passengers and crew. Each discovery was a new charge, a new count in the indictment against his career. The initial charge of obstructing a federal agent was now buried under an avalanche of far more serious offenses, falsifying records, dereliction of duty, knowingly operating an aircraft with a reported maintenance issue and a pattern of reckless and unsafe behavior. By the time Emma Reed and her team were finished 2 days later, they hadn't just documented an incident. They had exposed a systemic failure, one that implicated not just Marcus Thorne, but the culture of the airline that had allowed him to flourish. Emma prepared her final report. It would recommend the permanent revocation of Marcus Thorne's air transport pilot license. There would be no suspension, no chance for retraining. It would be a professional death sentence. But the report didn't stop there. It also recommended a full top-to-bottom FAA audit of Ascendair's training programs, its safety reporting system, and its management oversight. The hard karma was just beginning, and it was coming for the entire company. The consequences of Captain Marcus Thorne's actions descended with the swift and unforgiving force of gravity. The FAA's judgment was absolute. His air transport pilot license was permanently revoked. There would be no suspension, no retraining, no second chance. The career he had built over 3 decades vanished, leaving him a pariah in the industry he once ruled. Stripped of his wings, his pension heavily penalized, Thorne became a cautionary tale, a ghost who haunted crew lounges with whispers of his spectacular fall from grace. His arrogance had cost him everything, and he retreated into a quiet life of bitter regret, forever tormented by the 5 words that had sealed his fate. The karma, however, did not stop with one man. Dr. Emma Reed's report triggered a full-scale FAA audit of Ascendair, and the investigation was merciless. For 6 months, the airline was dissected, its culture of complacency laid bare. The findings were catastrophic: a record-breaking multi-million-dollar fine for systemic safety violations, the grounding of a portion of its fleet, and a public relations nightmare that sent its stock price plummeting. The most significant penalty was a federally mandated cultural and safety compliance program, a top-to-bottom overhaul of the entire airline. In a final fitting twist of justice, the FAA appointed Dr. Emma Reed to oversee its implementation. She worked not to punish, but to rebuild. Under her guidance, Ascendair transformed. The old guard, including VP Robert Henderson, who was forced into retirement, was replaced. A new, truly anonymous safety reporting system was created to empower junior crew members. Training was redesigned to prioritize communication and challenge ingrained hierarchies. In this new Ascendair, integrity was rewarded. First Officer Dennis Miller, lauded for his professionalism, was fast-tracked to captain and became a key instructor in the new training program. Lead flight attendant Sarah Jenkins was also promoted, her grace under pressure becoming a standard for the cabin crew to emulate. Ascendair survived, but it was humbled and fundamentally changed. It emerged a safer, more responsible airline, its culture reborn from the ashes of one man's prejudice. The story of Flight 815 became a legend within the aviation world, a stark reminder that the person you dismiss might hold your entire world in their hands, and that on the ground, just as in the air, character is everything. That single fateful encounter at Gate C-27 reveals a powerful truth. True authority isn't about the uniform you wear or the volume of your voice. It's about integrity, professionalism, and the quiet competence that can bring even the most arrogant person to their knees. Captain Thorne's downfall wasn't just about a clash of personalities. It was a necessary course correction in a system where safety must always triumph over ego. Dr. Emma Reed didn't just ground a pilot. She forced an entire airline to confront its demons and become better. The karma that hit Captain Thorne and Ascendair was not just swift, it was profoundly just, reshaping careers and rebuilding a culture from the ground up. If you believe that justice was served and that arrogance has no place in the cockpit, please hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that respect is non-negotiable. And for more incredible stories of real-life drama and hard karma, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories to tell.